The air in the family hall was stifling, thick with the heavy scent of incense and the low murmur of servants quietly attending to their duties. The soft rustle of silk robes brushed against the polished floors, and the faint creak of wooden beams echoed through the expansive hall as she stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold before her. The sprawling courtyard stretched beyond, the high walls that enclosed her once familiar world now feeling like a prison. She had stood in this same space countless times, but today, everything felt different. The familiar beauty of the room, once a sanctuary, now felt foreign, as though the very walls had turned their backs on her. Her gaze lingered on the ornate wooden chairs lined perfectly around the main table, the polished jade cups filled with tea, the golden trinkets adorning the walls. These had once been symbols of her place, her rightful position in this world. Yet now, they stood as silent reminders of what she had lost. She could feel the eyes of the others upon her, even though no one looked directly at her. It was the weight of the unspoken. The subtle distancing. She had become a ghost in the halls of her own home. Her hand rested at her side, fingers twitching slightly as if reaching for something, anything, to steady herself. But there was nothing to grasp. It had been so easy to pretend, to keep up the appearances, to walk the path laid before her without question. It had been easy, once, to be the rightful daughter of the house. To move through the family with purpose and grace, admired and respected. But something had changed. Something she couldn't put her finger on until now. Perhaps it was the way the servants' eyes slid past her as if they didn't see her at all, or the way the elders in the clan had begun to speak in whispers when she entered the room. The words spoken at the last gathering had been gentle, but their meanings were sharp, cutting through her with the precision of a dagger. She had once been a voice to be reckoned with in this family. Now, she was nothing more than a shadow, lingering on the edges, ignored, cast aside. The memory of that moment still lingered vividly in her mind, the silent betrayal of her own mother, the subtle shifting of roles without a single word of explanation. Her place in the family had been quietly erased, replaced by someone younger, more malleable, someone they could control. She remembered the day her mother had presented the new heir, a cousin born of a lesser branch, who, without a hint of ceremony, had taken her place in every way that mattered. The official title, the family name, the weight of legacy and inheritance, all had been transferred without a word to her. She had stood there, frozen, as her mother had cast her aside with a smile. It was a quiet betrayal, one that had been set in motion long before that moment, long before the whispers of her insignificance reached her ears. Her fingers tightened into fists, nails pressing into her palms, but the pain it caused was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. She had been forced to watch as someone else took what was rightfully hers. She had been displaced, not with force, but with finesse, a slow erosion of her position, a gentle pushing to the sidelines. And now, as she stood in the same hall where she had once held sway, she realized the full extent of it. The family had moved on without her, and she had been left behind, discarded like an old garment. Her breath caught in her throat as the full weight of the realization struck her. She was no longer the center of this world. She was an afterthought, a mere shadow of the person she had once been. Her place was not at the table. It was not in the family portrait. It was nowhere. She had become a stranger in her own home. A faint trembling ran through her limbs, and she instinctively stepped back, as if she could distance herself from the painful truth. The cold, familiar space felt suffocating, the distance between herself and those who had once been her closest allies now insurmountable. Her hand brushed against the edge of a carved wooden pillar, the intricate designs etched into it, once a symbol of strength, now seemed mocking. She had been marked, exiled from the center of the family by the invisible but unmistakable forces at play. She had been forgotten. But even in this moment, as the weight of abandonment bore down on her, a flicker of something stirred inside her, a quiet resolve, a spark of defiance. It would not be this way forever. She had been replaced, cast aside, but that did not mean her story was finished. She would not remain in the shadows. She would rise again, quietly, surely, and claim what was once hers. The power she had lost was not gone forever, it was merely waiting, buried beneath the layers of silence and manipulation. And when the time came, she would take it back. She had become adept at pretending, at fitting into the mold that was expected of her, a mask of grace and composure placed carefully over the sharp sting of her fading position. Every gesture, every smile was calculated, every word spoken in the same sweet, measured tones as before, but now there was an emptiness beneath it all. The warmth that used to fill the halls, the hum of conversation, had been replaced by a chilling silence, a quiet that pressed against her chest like an invisible weight. The heavy scent of incense, once a familiar comfort, now seemed to suffocate her, its sweetness cloying, reminding her of the rituals, the constant performance that had come to define her existence in this place. The hall was the same, yet everything about it felt different. The gold-framed mirrors reflected faces she once knew, but now those faces were unfamiliar. Their eyes avoided hers, gliding past her as if she were merely a fixture, as if she were nothing more than the drapery that adorned the walls. She moved through the room with the same grace, the same poise, but her steps felt heavier now, weighed down by the knowledge that she was no longer part of the family's center. She was merely a guest in her own home. As she seated herself at the table, the polite smiles and exchanged pleasantries felt like daggers wrapped in velvet. The servants, too, had begun to treat her differently, their movements more hurried when they brought her food, their eyes darting quickly to the other members of the family as though to avoid the uncomfortable task of acknowledging her presence. The delicate porcelain cup, always placed before her with care, was now handed to her last, as though it were an afterthought. The tea, once steeped to perfection, now seemed to taste faintly bitter, though she could not quite place why. Even the chair she had once occupied, always in the center of the table, was now at the edge, a small but unmistakable shift that made her pulse quicken with a quiet fury. She had no choice but to sit there, smile politely, and pretend she had not noticed. Her name, once uttered with reverence, now slipped past lips like a whisper, barely acknowledged in conversation. She heard it, but it no longer held the weight it once did. The mention of her title, once a symbol of her place, was now an empty formality, a gesture given more out of habit than respect. Every word that was spoken seemed to carry a weight she had not been prepared for, each syllable, each glance, was a reminder of how far she had fallen from grace. The masks they wore were flawless, and she had been forced to wear one too, blending into the shadows of her own home. Every movement of the others, every action, every smile, was calculated, hiding the underlying truth. She was no longer the one they looked to. She was no longer the one they needed. The matriarch sat at the head of the table, her gaze cool and distant, the faintest of smiles playing at her lips as she looked over the room. There was no warmth in her eyes, no acknowledgement of the past between them. The others, her cousins, her aunts, even the servants, moved around her as though she were a piece of the furniture, as if her very presence no longer held any weight. The space she had once filled, the space that had once been hers to command, was now occupied by someone else. Her mother had placed the new heir, the younger cousin, at the center of the family's attention, and she had stepped aside, silently relinquishing the title and the responsibility that should have been hers. Her role had been quietly erased, swept aside like dust from the floor, and no one had dared to speak of it. She could not bear to look at the new heir, the one who had replaced her, the one who had been groomed to take her place. It was all done with such quiet precision, such politeness, that it was almost impossible to object. Even her own family, the people who had once called her sister, daughter, ally, now looked through her as if she were nothing more than a passing shadow. The surface of it all was perfectly smooth, as if nothing had changed. The servants still bowed to her, the smiles still came, the cups of tea were still offered, but the silence spoke louder than any words could. She could feel it in the way they moved, in the way their eyes flickered over her face, always avoiding, never lingering. She was no longer central to the family's purpose, no longer a key player in the games of power that played out behind closed doors. She was a peripheral figure now, a faded remnant of a past that no longer held any relevance. The absence of her status was more painful than any open confrontation could have been. It was the coldness, the disregard, that stung. It was the deliberate, calculated way in which they ignored her, the way they made sure she knew her place without uttering a single word. The subtle shifts in position, the way the servants moved quicker when they came near her, the way her name was spoken with such indifference, it was all part of the same game, a game she had been forced to play without ever being told the rules. She was silent, her body still, her face serene, but beneath the surface, a storm was building. The realization, the painful truth, settled in deeper with each passing moment. She was no longer seen, no longer respected, no longer part of this family's future. She was a ghost, drifting through a life she no longer controlled. And yet, despite everything, despite the coldness that surrounded her, despite the mask she wore, a flicker of something else began to rise within her. It was small at first, a barely perceptible shift, but it was there, a spark of defiance, a whisper of something she had long buried deep within herself. The family might have forgotten her, but she had not forgotten herself. She would not be erased so easily. The banquet hall was as grand as ever, the long wooden tables arranged with precision, their gleaming surfaces adorned with porcelain plates and silver chopsticks. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and fragrant wine, but even the feast seemed distant, like an echo from another world. The laughter of the family members filled the room, but she felt a quiet void, as though her presence was no longer fully acknowledged. She had once been the one to lead the conversation, to direct the flow of the evening, but now she sat at the edge of the table, her presence little more than a shadow. She could still hear the murmurs of her own voice in her memory, the confident way she had once spoken, the way others had listened. But that was before the subtle shifts had begun, before she had realized that her place in this family was no longer assured. She remembered a particular evening, a family gathering long ago, where everything had seemed so perfect, so sure. Her father, the head of the family, had summoned everyone to the grand hall for a formal dinner. The occasion had been marked by an air of importance, an heir was to be named. She had anticipated this moment for years, convinced that she would be the one to carry the family's legacy forward. She had never questioned it. It was her birthright, after all. The heir was chosen based on merit, on ability, on the strength of one's character. At least, that was what she had believed. But as the evening wore on, she began to notice the subtle differences. The way the servants had arranged the seating that night had been the first sign. The head of the table, once hers by right, had been occupied by another. Her younger cousin, still a mere child, no more than 12, sat there, with the family members flanking him on either side. And there, at the far end of the table, sat she, alone, separated. The gap between her and the rest of the family had never seemed so wide. She had tried to convince herself it was nothing, a mere mistake, a sign of inexperience, but deep down, she felt the sting of it. Her father's gaze had drifted past her that evening as he spoke, never lingering, never acknowledging her presence in any meaningful way. The words he spoke were aimed at the child beside him, the one he had chosen to place in the center of everything. He had not even looked at her when he announced the heir, the one who would take over the family's leadership. The heir, the young cousin, had smiled sweetly, his eyes bright with an innocence that made the whole affair feel almost cruel. He had not yet learned what it meant to bear the weight of their name, the pressure of their legacy, but there he was, sitting in the seat of power. And she, who had lived her life preparing for this moment, had been overlooked. She remembered how, as the evening wore on, the servants had moved quickly around her, placing her food last, serving her tea last. Even the wine, which was always offered first to the head of the family, had been given to the others before her. It had all been so small, so subtle, but it was enough to make her feel it. She had been a daughter of the house, groomed for leadership, but now she was a stranger at the table, a mere observer of a future that did not belong to her. The laughter of her cousins, the quiet whispers of approval for the chosen heir, all seemed to mock her as she sat there, silent, watching it unfold. Her heart had been heavy with the weight of those moments, but she had kept her face calm. No one could see the turmoil within her. She smiled, nodded politely, even as the feeling of abandonment sank deeper. The moment had passed, but the sting of it had stayed with her. The heir was established, and she was not the one to carry the family forward. She was not the one to inherit the mantle. But at that moment, she had still hoped. She had hoped that perhaps this was a temporary arrangement, that perhaps things would return to their rightful order. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, she had begun to understand. The place that should have been hers, the place she had expected to inherit, had been taken from her without a word. She had been silently removed from the center, and no one had bothered to explain why. The quiet manipulation of it all had been so deft, so well executed, that she had not even realized it at first. But now, as she sat at the edge of the table, she could see it all clearly. Her father's choice had been deliberate. He had chosen the cousin, not for his ability, but for his obedience. He had chosen the one who could be easily controlled, the one who would follow the rules set by those who held the real power. The family had decided long ago that she was too strong, too independent, too much of a threat to their carefully constructed order. And so, they had chosen another, someone weaker, someone who would not challenge their hold on the family. She had not seen it then, had not understood the subtlety of the plot. But now, as she sat quietly at the edge of the table, it became painfully clear. She was no longer the one they needed. Her place had been taken, quietly, and without a word, and she had been left to pick up the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. The subtle shift in power, the slight changes in how she was treated, had led her here, on the edge, in the shadows of the family she had once belonged to. She had been replaced, not with force, but with the calm, calculated precision of those who had always controlled the family from behind the scenes. The heir was theirs, not hers. She was nothing more than a remnant, a lingering presence that could be ignored, sidelined, and forgotten. The family's ties were stronger than her own blood. And as the evening drew to a close, she quietly rose from the table, the weight of the past settling on her shoulders, but also something else, a spark, faint but undeniable, that began to take root. She would not accept this fate. She would not remain in the margins. The world around her had changed, and she would change with it. It was a formal evening, one of those events that had once filled her with pride, the family's annual gathering to honor their ancestors and secure the family's future. The grand hall was again dressed in its finest, lanterns casting soft glows on the polished stone floors, and the scent of incense mingling with the scent of rich food, filling the air with something almost sacred. The patriarch was seated at the head of the table, a position that had once been hers to command, a place from which her words had carried weight. Now, she sat at the far end, behind the shadows of those who had replaced her. It was customary for such events to be marked by certain rituals, the kneeling before the ancestral tablets, the offering of tea to the elders, the assigning of tasks and duties for the year ahead. But for her, everything had begun to feel mechanical, a string of gestures designed to preserve appearances. She could no longer tell if it was the formality of the occasion or the stark shift in her position that made everything feel so cold. Tonight was to be no different from the others, she had convinced herself. She would smile, she would nod, she would fulfill her role, as she had done so many times before. But as the evening unfolded, she realized that the rules had changed. She had been preparing herself for this moment, rehearsing the smiles, the gestures, the expected nods. But what she had not expected was how the family's attention would subtly shift. The familiar figures of her relatives, once her closest companions, now seemed distant. The way they spoke to her had changed. Her name, once said with reverence, was now mentioned in passing, almost as an afterthought, as if her very existence were no longer of consequence. The family had gathered around the central table, where the main matters of the household would be discussed. As the eldest daughter, she had always been at the heart of these discussions, her voice given weight as it carried through the room. Tonight, however, she was pushed to the margins. She was seated at the far side of the room, away from the most important conversations, surrounded by others who were either too young or too insignificant to have any true say in the family's affairs. Her father's eyes never met hers as he spoke to her cousin, the one who had been recently elevated in rank. The younger man, barely into his 20s, was now positioned in a place of prominence, his every word treated with the utmost respect. She noticed how, when the time came to offer the tea to the family's elders, it was not her who was chosen, but him. She had been overlooked, passed over, as if her place no longer mattered. It was not that she had expected preferential treatment, but the weight of the slight was undeniable. It was the smallest of gestures, the simplest of actions, yet they spoke volumes. She could feel the eyes of the servants as they moved past her, swiftly attending to the needs of the newly elevated family member, but barely acknowledging her presence. Even the manner in which her name was spoken had changed. Once, it had been a title, a reminder of her place. Now, it was a faint echo, a word that held no real meaning. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she took the cup that had been handed to her, the porcelain cool against her fingertips. She forced a smile, lifting the cup to her lips, but the taste of the tea felt bitter, a silent reminder of how the family's gaze had shifted from her. The others, her cousins, her aunts, the servants, they all moved in a silent rhythm, acknowledging her as a distant figure, something to be tolerated, but not engaged with. The words spoken to her were polite, but their coldness chilled her more than any harsh reprimand could have. The conversation flowed around her, but she was not a part of it. It was as if she were invisible, as if the role she had once played in this family was no longer needed. She looked at her father, seated at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the cousin beside him. His words, his actions, they were all focused on the younger man now, the one who had been positioned as the future of the family. She had no place in this future. She was a shadow in the background, a relic of the past. As the evening wore on, her thoughts began to slip back to another time, another gathering where the weight of her family's expectations had been made painfully clear. It had been a time when she had still been at the heart of everything, when her role in the family was unchallenged, unquestioned. But that night, as she had walked into the hall, she had felt it, a shift, subtle at first, but undeniable. She remembered how her father had looked at her, his gaze distant, his words measured. She had sat beside him, waiting for her moment to speak, but that moment never came. It was the first time she had truly understood how easily things could change. She had been so sure, so confident in her place, but now, as the evening unfolded, she saw how easily she had been replaced. The family had moved on without her, had chosen someone else to carry the mantle. It wasn't an open rejection, no dramatic words had been spoken, but the signs had been there. The empty chair beside her father, the cold tea offered to her last, the whispers that stopped when she entered the room, all of it added up, piece by piece, until she could no longer deny it. She had been pushed aside. She had been replaced. But still, she said nothing. Still, she wore her mask. The night carried on, and the family continued its rituals, but she knew, deep down, that she had been cast out. Yet even as she sat there, surrounded by people who had once been her closest allies, there was a flicker of something inside her, a feeling that the family's rejection could not last forever. She would not remain in the shadows. No, she would take back what was hers. She had been forgotten, yes, but she would not stay forgotten. She would reclaim her place, her power, even if it meant standing alone. She had long suspected it, but now, in the quiet of the night, the full weight of what had been done to her became undeniable. It was a gathering like many others, the family's ritual of granting titles and assigning responsibilities, the once expected occasion that should have filled her with pride. This time, however, the air around her felt heavy with something more, something she had not yet fully allowed herself to grasp. Sitting at the long table, the same stone-cold calm that had settled over her during previous gatherings returned. But tonight, she could not ignore the feeling that had been gnawing at her for weeks, months perhaps, that her place, her role, her very identity in this family had been subtly, but irreversibly, dismantled. The patriarch had spoken to everyone with the same stern yet respectful tone, his eyes gliding over her as he delivered his announcements, barely lingering for a moment on her face. The words were familiar, ritualistic, a series of polite acknowledgments and titles, a granting of names and rights that had once belonged to her by birthright. But tonight, there was no comfort in those words. There was only the cold, stark realization that they had been stripped from her, piece by piece, with the quiet precision of an invisible hand. The position she had once held, the rights she had been assured of, had been given away, assigned to someone younger, someone more compliant, someone who had not yet even grasped the depth of their responsibilities. A cousin, barely more than a child, now stood where she should have. The honor that had once belonged to her was now his to bear, and the title that should have been passed down to her had been quietly diverted. Even now, she could still hear the echo of her father's words in her ears. They had been spoken with such calm, such rationale, as though nothing had changed, as though there were no betrayal in what he had said. "This is for the good of the family," he had said, his voice smooth as silk, but behind it, she could hear the underlying message, the message that her sacrifice, her place, was now secondary, less significant than the needs of the family as a whole. The family. The word had always held such power for her, a reminder of blood, of duty, of legacy. But now, the word felt like a chain, binding her, suffocating her, chaining her to a role she could no longer play. She had been made to feel that her presence was no longer necessary, her worth reduced to nothing more than a distant memory of what she had once been. She remembered the day when the decision had first been hinted at. It had been a casual conversation, as most things in this family were, disguised beneath layers of formality and decorum. Her father, her mother, the elders, they had all spoken, in that way they did when things were decided for her, as though she had no voice in the matter. The heir, the future of the family, had been determined not by her strength, not by her ability, but by the quiet politics of power, of who could be controlled, who would bow to the unspoken rules of the house. She had never been given a choice in the matter. She had never been allowed to voice her opinion. The others, those who had no real claim to the family's leadership, had been elevated, and she had been relegated to the shadows. They had taken from her not only the title, but her very identity within the family, the very essence of who she was. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, a piece to be moved when it suited them, cast aside when it no longer served their purpose. Her breath quickened as the realization sank deeper into her chest. It was not just the title, not just the position, that had been stolen from her, it was her very sense of self. The family, once her fortress, had become a place of exile, where she was nothing more than a spectator to her own life. And still, she remained silent. Still, she sat at the table, her hands clasped in her lap, her face carefully neutral, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The empty chair beside her was a reminder of the space she no longer filled. The servants' quick glances, the hushed whispers as they passed her, all of it was a reminder that she no longer belonged here. She had been abandoned in favor of a new heir, someone who would fit more neatly into the family's carefully crafted image. And yet, she had been made to play the part, to smile and nod, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But the truth was becoming clearer with each passing moment. She was not here to be respected. She was here to serve the greater good, to play the role that had been assigned to her, nothing more, nothing less. The family was no longer hers. She had been replaced, erased, and all the love, all the respect she had once known was now turned to someone else. As the evening wore on, the contrast became even more apparent. Her cousin, the new heir, was lavished with praise, his future, his role, his place in the family all openly discussed as though there were no question. Her role, on the other hand, was scarcely acknowledged. Even the slightest remark about her name, her contribution, was laced with indifference. She had been nothing more than a footnote in her own life, a token gesture to fill a space that no longer mattered. Her father's gaze, her mother's quiet approval, none of it was hers anymore. The family had moved on without her, and in their eyes, she had become nothing more than a distant memory. The betrayal was not in the harsh words spoken aloud, but in the silence, in the way the family moved around her as though she were not truly there. The coldness of it was more painful than any open confrontation could have been. And still, she said nothing. She remained silent, still, her eyes focused on the flickering candlelight, the shadows dancing on the walls. She had been replaced, yes, but it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The soft murmur of the family continued to wash over her as the evening pressed on, but something had shifted within her. It was subtle at first, a momentary hesitation in her father's voice, a flicker of discomfort in the way her cousin now sat next to the patriarch, a small, yet significant detail that passed unnoticed by the others. She had felt it, though. The absence. Her rightful place at the table had not just been taken, but it had been forgotten, replaced by a facade of kindness, a polite mask that now seemed suffocating. The subtlety of the slight was what made it so painful, as if no one dared to say what was true, yet everyone knew it. Her father's hand rested lightly on her cousin's shoulder, a gesture that should have meant nothing, yet to her, it felt like the final confirmation. The weight of his hand was the weight of the family's decision, a decision made in silence, a decision that did not require words. She was no longer the daughter of this house. She was no longer needed. The family had shifted around her, moved on, and she was left standing at the periphery, her presence now little more than a ghost. It was in that moment, as the conversation continued without her, that the truth finally dawned in its entirety. It was not just the seating arrangement, not just the polite smiles. It was the way the family had simply carried on as if she were no longer part of their world. They had placed someone else at the center. They had made their choice. And she, in their eyes, had become irrelevant. She had been given a role, one that was far smaller than the one she had once held. A smile was offered her way, a glance that was not cruel but indifferent. The words of praise were directed elsewhere, where they had always been directed now. Her presence had been reduced to a polite formality. Her existence, in this family, had been diluted into something unimportant, and the weight of that fact hit her with a sharp clarity. She could no longer pretend. The silence in the room felt louder now, deafening in its cruelty. Her hands, which had remained steady through the evening, now felt heavy. Her grip tightened on the delicate porcelain cup before her. The tea, once a familiar comfort, now tasted bitter, as though it had been poisoned by the weight of her own realization. She could feel her chest tightening, a subtle but undeniable ache in her throat. But she did not speak. She could not. The words were stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside her, buried beneath the layers of silence that she had been forced to carry for so long. It was not until the family had gathered around the hearth, the discussion turning toward future plans, that the final straw broke. Her father, with his usual composure, had announced, in the gentlest terms, that the family's management would be placed into the hands of her cousin, the newly appointed heir. The words were meant to sound kind, even generous, but to her, they were a cruel mockery of what she had once believed to be true. There was no mention of her role, no recognition of the contribution she had made, no acknowledgement of the years she had spent dutifully serving the family. She had been a part of the family's rise, but now, she was no longer needed. The words were soft, respectful, but they cut her deeper than any sharp remark ever could. It was the final confirmation that she had been displaced. She was no longer part of the core of this family. She was no longer the future of the house. The world she had fought so hard to belong to had quietly, gently, turned its back on her. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the teacup down, her fingers brushing the rim for a moment longer than necessary. The motion was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her realize that there was nothing left for her here. She rose from the table without a word, her movement slow, deliberate. The weight in her chest seemed unbearable, but she did not allow herself to falter. She did not look back as she walked toward the door, her feet carrying her away from the gathering, from the life she had once known. The soft murmur of the family faded behind her, but it was the silence that spoke the loudest. She had been left behind. The family had made its choice. She was no longer a part of their future, and that was something she could no longer ignore. The door closed quietly behind her as she stepped into the quiet hallway, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. The suffocating weight of the evening, the polite cruelty, the polite neglect, it was all gone, replaced by the undeniable truth. She had been forgotten. But she had also been freed. The realization settled in with a heavy, bittersweet finality. She would never be the person she once was in this house. But she was not defeated. The game had changed, and she was no longer content to play by their rules. It was time for a new path. It was time for a new beginning. She had not intended to linger in the room, but as she stepped inside, she found herself frozen in place. The familiar space seemed unchanged at first, but as her eye swept across the room, she realized how much had shifted. The wooden furniture, the delicate vases of flowers, the embroidered curtains, everything was in its place, but it felt different now, like a mask hiding the emptiness beneath. This room, once her sanctuary, had become a mere echo of the life she had once led. She walked slowly toward the table where she had spent countless hours, her fingers brushing the surface of the polished wood. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that it no longer felt like hers. The space had been subtly claimed, not by force, but by the quiet erosion of time. She began to gather the few personal items that remained, folding them into a small bundle with the same care she had always given them, but now it felt like she was packing away someone else's life, not her own. She didn't know how long she had been standing there. Time felt like it had slowed down, as if the air itself had thickened, making it difficult to move. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silence of the room, the soft padding of her shoes on the floor sounding louder than they should have been. She paused again, gazing at the intricately carved screen that separated the room from the hallway. The familiar design of her father's crest, once proudly displayed on the screen, now seemed distant. It was a symbol of her family's legacy, but now it felt foreign, as though it had never belonged to her. The hallway beyond, the one that had once been filled with the sound of her footsteps, now seemed vast, empty. The servants no longer stopped to bow as she passed, their eyes skimming over her as if she were no more than a shadow. It was a small thing, but it stung more than she could have imagined. She had once been a part of that world, a fixture in the daily life of the household. But now, she was nothing more than an afterthought, someone who no longer mattered. She could hear the voices from the family meeting hall echoing faintly through the corridor, but the words they spoke were not meant for her. They were the words of the new heir, the words of the family's future, not hers. Her footsteps slowed as she passed by the family altar, the sacred place where the ancestors were honored. The incense still burned, the faint smoke rising in delicate spirals, but the reverence that had once filled this space now felt hollow. It was as if the ancestors themselves had turned away from her, their gaze no longer upon her but on the one who had replaced her. The rituals, the customs that had once held such meaning, now seemed like a hollow shell, devoid of any true connection. As she walked past, she couldn't help but notice how the servants, still lingering in the halls, turned their heads away when she passed. Their eyes no longer held the familiar respect, only a distant acknowledgement. Even the children who had once followed her, imitating her every move, now ignored her, their attention focused elsewhere. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the very space that had once defined her life now pressing in, suffocating her with its indifference. She had been the center once. The world had revolved around her. But that world had moved on, leaving her behind. The realization settled in like a stone in her chest. Her place had been taken, not by force, not by confrontation, but by the quiet passage of time, by the slow but deliberate shifting of allegiances. Her name, her title, her role in this family, they were no longer hers to claim. She was no longer needed. The subtlety of it was the hardest part to bear. The fact that no one had spoken the words aloud, that no one had openly dismissed her, this was what made it so unbearable. She was pushed aside without a fight, without even the courtesy of a confrontation. And yet, the message was clear. She was no longer part of the family's future. She was no longer the one to lead them. She was no longer the one they looked to. She could hear the murmur of the family meeting in the distance, the sounds of her cousin's voice, his every word now treated with such importance, and she could feel the bitterness rising in her throat. She had been forgotten. She had been replaced. And no one had bothered to tell her. No one had bothered to explain. She was nothing now. Nothing but a forgotten memory in the halls of her own home. She stood still for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She felt her chest tighten, but she did not allow herself to react. There was no room for it. There was no room for weakness. Instead, she took a deep breath, adjusting her robes as she stood in the middle of the hallway, her back straight. She would not let them see how much it hurt. She would not let them see how deeply the betrayal had cut. She turned toward the door, her movements calm, collected, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She could feel it in her bones. She could feel the weight of the change in the very air around her. She was no longer a part of this world. She was no longer the person she had once been. The silence of the hallway stretched on, and with each step she took, the realization grew clearer, she had been replaced, and there was no turning back. The door closed softly behind her as she stepped into the night, and for the first time, she allowed herself to exhale. The world had moved on without her. And now, so would she. The night was still, the silence of the mansion oppressive, and yet something within her had shifted, settled into a quiet certainty. It was not an explosive revelation or an eruption of emotion. There were no angry words, no cries for justice. The realization that she had been replaced, overlooked, and discarded had already been absorbed, the sting of betrayal softened by time. What remained now was an unspoken clarity, a quiet acceptance of the way things were, but also a deep, deliberate resolve to take back what was hers. The family's gatherings had become more like performances, her presence little more than a courtesy, a nod to the past. She no longer sought the approval that once fueled her, no longer wished for the validation that came with standing at the heart of the household. Her focus had shifted, and with it, her understanding of her place within this world. She stood in front of the worn wooden desk, her fingers brushing over the old, familiar ledger, the family records. The books that once held the name of her line, the name she had inherited by blood, now seemed like relics of another time. She carefully opened the pages, her eyes tracing the inked lines that detailed every transaction, every promise made, every legacy passed down through the generations. Her father's name was boldly written in the columns, the names of her siblings and cousins following in neat, meticulous rows. And there, at the bottom of the page, was her own name, but it no longer held the same weight. It was an afterthought, a fleeting entry on a page that had already moved on to someone else. She closed the book with a soft sigh, the sound almost imperceptible, and reached for the small leather pouch that lay beside it. She unlatched it, revealing the delicate silver key inside, the key to the family vault. It had once been hers to carry, a symbol of her responsibility, of her role in safeguarding the family's wealth, its future. But now, it felt like nothing more than a piece of metal, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. She slipped the key into her palm, feeling the cold metal against her skin, and for the first time, she did not feel the weight of it. Instead, she felt an odd sense of freedom, a quiet liberation. She no longer needed to hold on to it. She was no longer bound by the expectations of the past. Slowly, she rose from the desk and walked across the room to the small wooden chest where her personal belongings were kept. The chest had always been hers to use, but now, as she ran her fingers over the carved wood, she could not help but notice how it felt foreign, almost estranged. She took a deep breath, opened the chest, and began to carefully sort through the items inside, trinkets, letters, a small collection of jewelry that had once been her mother's. Each item was a reminder of a life she had once lived, a life that was slipping further and further away from her grasp. The fine silk dresses, the delicate combs, the jade hairpins, everything seemed so far removed from the person she had become. She touched each item lightly, with no sense of attachment, no yearning to return to what had been. There was no regret, no desire to cling to the past. She was ready to let go. Her fingers brushed over a small box, hidden at the bottom of the chest. It was a simple thing, nothing extraordinary, but it had always held significance. She lifted it out carefully and opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of red silk, was the family's signet ring. The ring had been passed down through generations, a symbol of authority, of leadership. It had once been hers to wear, hers to use as a mark of her position in the family. But now, as she gazed at it, she realized that it no longer belonged to her. It was not her role to wear it. She placed the ring back in the box, closed the lid, and set it aside. There was no need to hold on to these things anymore. She had a different path now, one that no longer required the trappings of the past. Her eyes moved to the window, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking it all in, the stillness, the quiet, the sense of finality that had settled over her. She had been cast aside, yes, but in doing so, she had gained something. She had gained clarity. She was no longer part of the family's inner circle, no longer a key player in their future. But that did not mean she was powerless. It did not mean she had no place in this world. It meant that she could forge a new path, one that was entirely her own. She turned away from the chest and walked toward the door. She would no longer be the daughter of this house, no longer the one they turned to for guidance. But she would no longer be invisible, either. Her role would change, yes, but she would make that change on her terms. She would not wait for their permission. The hallway outside was empty, the house silent, as if the very walls knew that something had shifted. She walked through the familiar corridors, but now they felt different, more like a passageway to a new beginning than a reminder of a life left behind. She no longer needed to be part of their world. She would create her own. And as she passed the family crest on the wall, she did not look at it with longing, but with quiet resolve. It was no longer hers to claim. But it would be no matter. Her future would not be defined by the past. Her path was her own to carve, and she would walk it with quiet strength, with a purpose that could not be swayed. She did not need their approval. She did not need their recognition. She would find her own place in this world, and it would be a place of her making. The mansion was still. The muted sounds of servants attending to their daily duties echoed faintly in the background, but they seemed far removed from her now. She walked through the familiar halls with a calmness that only a few days ago would have seemed impossible. Everything around her was the same, yet nothing felt the same. The space she had once inhabited with such certainty now felt distant, as though she were walking through a world that no longer belonged to her. The crisp air of the evening brushed against her skin, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the corners of the rooms. It was all too familiar, but she was no longer a part of it. She had already come to terms with the fact that she would never return to the position she had once held. The family's power had shifted, and she was no longer at the center. But that no longer mattered to her. She had no desire to reclaim what had been taken. Instead, she had found something far more valuable, control over her own fate. Her hands were steady as she moved through the family's records, her fingers tracing the delicate pages of the ledger that detailed the family's wealth and assets. The names written there, her father's, her cousins', held no more power over her. She was no longer bound by their expectations. The inheritance, the status, the title, these things were no longer hers to claim, and she no longer wished to claim them. Instead, she had found something else. Something more lasting. In silence, she had begun to gather what was rightfully hers, the pieces of her life that had once been stolen from her, quietly, without her knowledge. She had already taken back the family signet ring, carefully hidden away in a small box. She had also retrieved the important documents, those that tied her to the family's future, those that gave her a stake in its legacy. But this time, it was different. This time, she was not doing it for the sake of reclaiming power. She was doing it for herself. Her eyes flickered over the familiar space once more, noting the absence of the possession she had once prized, the one she had been made to leave behind. The trinkets, the gifts, the jewelry that had once been symbols of her place in the family, these things no longer held meaning. They were empty symbols, and the family who had bestowed them upon her had long since abandoned her. The power had shifted, and she no longer needed their validation. She had walked away from the center of their world, but now she could see it for what it truly was, fragile, fleeting. She took one last look at the family crest on the wall, its once glorious shine now dulled, its edges worn with time. It had been a mark of her identity, her lineage, but now it felt like a relic of a past life. The family, the house, the people, none of it defined her anymore. She had reclaimed herself. Her own sense of worth, her own path, were now hers to follow. There was nothing more to be gained here, no more need for recognition or approval. She had no intention of returning to the life she had left behind. She was done with it, and in that quiet realization, there was peace. Her fingers closed around the small bundle of documents, her legacy now secure in her hands, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of release. The family, the politics, the power games, they no longer held sway over her. She had stepped away, detached herself completely. The door to her old life had quietly closed behind her, and there was no turning back. In the quiet of the night, as the last of the servants finished their tasks and the house fell into an uneasy stillness, she stepped outside. She did not look back. The moonlight bathed her in its pale glow as she walked toward the distant horizon. There was no need for words, no need for a grand declaration. Her silence spoke louder than any proclamation ever could. She had let go. She had moved on. The family's future was no longer her concern. Her future, her own destiny, was hers to decide. and she would walk it on her own terms. As her footsteps echoed in the distance, a soft, fleeting thought passed through her mind. She had once been a part of something larger, but now she was free. Her past, her legacy, it was all behind her. It was time to create something new. How many of us are truly free to choose our own path?